Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Robert Perry, founder of the Circle. And today we are talking about an issue that has long been on the minds of many students of this path, and it's where is the feminine in the Course? I was just saying before we hit record that this is the third time that we have recorded this podcast. And so if you're wondering why we're so late in getting this posted, it's partly because we decided to record it again. And then we decided to record it again. There are a few reasons for this. First and foremost, both Robert and I had this nagging sense that we wanted to do a better job presenting the big picture of the way in which A Course in Miracles approaches the feminine. It really is a truly beautiful and moving vision, and we don't want to fall short in capturing it. But part of what makes the Course's vision so beautiful is that it's such a contrast to the way in which women have been viewed in conventional religion. And in previous recordings of this podcast, we just didn't feel like we addressed that fully enough. And another thing that we didn't share in the previous recordings of this podcast is that the inspiration for it came last summer when I was on a walk and I was listening to an episode of the Miracle Voices podcast from the Foundation for Inner Peace. And it was a podcast called Victim Victorious. And in that podcast, Tam Morgan, who is the Foundation for Inner Peace co-president, shared a story where she was having a massage by a guy who, in the process of giving her that massage, touched her inappropriately. And as I was listening to that episode, I found myself very moved by the main point of it, which is how Tam came to a place of forgiveness and healing with the man who had abused her. But at the same time, I found myself just sad and mad, really, that women are so routinely caught in these systems that so casually harm and exploit them. And so I'm on my walk and I'm letting all of this in, and I felt like Tam had handled the situation really admirably, but I also felt her dilemma really strongly. And I think a lot of Course students can relate to this, where you see or you experience an injustice in the world and you want to respond to it with love and forgiveness, while at the same time, you also want to do something that lets the other person know that their behavior was wrong. And so I was wrestling with this. I was angry, but I wanted to be loving. And when I came back from my walk, I discovered that while I was gone, Robert had been reading an article that was somewhat related. So do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, it was a book review about a book called Unwell Women. And it was about basically how women have fared at the hands of the medical system going all the way back to Hippocrates. And the author kind of summed it all up in saying that medicine has insisted on pathologizing femaleness and by extension, womanhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pathologizing femaleness. Yeah, so like in Tam's situation, in the name of healing, you were reading this article that we have these situations where in the name of healing, women are actually being harmed. And so we have these systems that are supposed to advance the health and wellness of women, and yet they're compromised on just basic levels of fairness to women. And healthcare, at least, has the appearance of being for everyone. Women aren't turned away from treatment because they're women, for example. But to the point of this podcast, that's not the case when it comes to conventional religion. And so after listening to Tam on the Miracle Voices podcast, and after you read that article, our conversation turned to how women are treated in healthcare, and that spilled over into how women are treated in religion, and how the Course offers an antidote to that. And that's really why we're here. And so to back up just a bit, I can't speak to all faiths, but you and I both grew up Christian, and so this is the area that we know best. And in evangelical Christianity, there is a complementarian attitude towards women that says women are helpers of men, and so they can't assume leadership positions in home or church. And it's a position that exists in evangelical circles to this day. And those who hold this view, and I'm certainly not saying that every Christian does, but Christians who do feel this way defend their position by citing places in the Bible like Ephesians 5, where it says the husband is the head of his wife as Christ is head of the church. There's 1 Corinthians 14, where it says women should remain silent in the churches, and if they do want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home. And there's also 1 Timothy, where it says women are forbidden from teaching men. And so there is this long-standing, misogynist, pervasive culture in religion that marginalizes and subjugates women, and it's baked into the founding documents with profound political and cultural ramifications. Because if the strength of a nation depends on a patriarchal home and a patriarchal church, which is the traditional complementarian view, then those who hold those views are going to extend them outside of the home and the church to things like business and politics. And what can that accomplish other than sidelining 50% of the population in all aspects of life? And so into this very gloomy picture comes A Course in Miracles. And as we'll discuss, there are feminine references in the Course, but on first glance, they're pretty hard to spot, because the language used to describe all of the key figures in the Course, without exception, is masculine. The Course refers to God as Father, Holy Spirit is male, Christ, which the Course defines as the self we all share, is male. All living things are collectively referred to as the Son of God. When the Course speaks of other people, it refers to them as brothers. The Course was authored by Jesus. And so in the absence of female presence in the material, it's easy to wonder or even to assume that there's some kind of inherent bias here. And we are going to get into the feminine references in the Course in just a minute, but particularly if spirit is genderless, Robert, why do you think the Course uses such exclusively masculine language? That's a lot, I know.
Yeah, and it's an important question. I think part of the answer, which should be obvious to us, is the Course was written a long time ago. So the whole movement for gender neutral language didn't really come in until the 70s. Up until that time, it was just the way of referring. You talked about mankind and man and he. And so I think that's part of the explanation. But I think the most important part of the explanation, the larger part, is that Jesus has a penchant that shows itself throughout the Course from beginning to end for taking available cultural forms, which he knows are harmful, and filling them with new content as a way of healing the harm that has been done. And I think it's exactly what he does with the masculine terminology in the Course.
Yeah, we were talking about this before, and I was like, well, if shouldn't Jesus have had the foresight to have more inclusive language in the Course? And so what do you want to say to that?
Yeah, I just don't think that's his style. For one reason or another, he doesn't invent new forms. He takes the available ones, just like with an educational course, with a text, a workbook, and a manual for teachers. Over and over, he takes available forms and he fills them with new content. I think that's part of, well, it's definitely a reflection of his teaching about how the Holy Spirit works in the world. The Holy Spirit can take anything we've made, literally anything, and fill it with new content, give it a new purpose, give it new meaning, a new use, and thereby something that is the most unholy thing actually becomes holy because it's now devoted to a holy purpose. And it's just his way of it's how he sees the Holy Spirit working, and by extension is how he himself works. And, we may have beefs with it. I wish to God there have been more feminine references throughout the Course, but it is how he does things.
But there are feminine references in the course, and you've collected them. So let's go through them.
Yeah, it's not hard to collect them, unfortunately.
You can
Okay.
basically count them on one hand, but they're
Yeah.
there.
So what happened was you can see as the culture shifted and the available cultural forms were now different, what Helen was hearing from him shifted. So it started in 1974. Her poems began to contain feminine references. And these poems were not really written by her, they were heard by her. She considered them to be from some higher part of herself rather than from Jesus, as she considered the Course, but still she was hearing them, she was channeling them. So in 74, her poems began to take on feminine references. In 75, she scribed the clarification of terms. So the manual for teachers had ended at the end of 72. But 3 years later, in the latter part of 75, she took down the clarification of terms, and that contained a reference to a mother singing her child to rest. Then in 77, 2 years later, she took down the Song of Prayer, which refers to prayer and forgiveness as sisters in our salvation. And then in 78, she took down the scribing at the end of the poetry collection. And the scribing is called The Gifts of God, which is confusingly the same name as the poetry collection, but it's not one of her poems. It's her final scribing from Jesus, and it has the most feminine references of all. It talks about a mother, and there's an extended description of a mother. It talks about a lover who misses his love, who is talked about as feminine. There's another mother reference in there. So really, as the 70s went forward, and the culture was changing, so was her channeling.
Yeah, and just as a timeline for students who may be newer to the course, the course came through Helen starting in 65 through 72, and these feminine references appear, as you're saying, in 74. So the
Right.
course had already been scribed, but the feminine references start appearing in her poems, and you see them sparingly, albeit, but you see them up until 78, and then she died in 81. And
she didn't really scribe anything after that Gifts of God thing.
Yeah,
That's
and
considered her
you and
final
I
authentic scribing.
often say that we wish Helen had lived longer, because it feels like so much more wanted to come through her.
Well, and the last thing she got, she was told that she was still needed to bring forth messages in the world. And
yeah,
is
so
that
we'll never
poignant
know.
or what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll never know, but still, I think it's telling that this more feminine language started to come through, and then unfortunately she passed away.
Yeah.
But in addition to the feminine references in the course, and we do consider the Gifts of God and obviously the clarification of terms, Song of Prayer and whatnot, to be part of the course canon. So we say part of the course, we consider these things to be part of the course, even though they're not the main 3 volumes of the course.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be they were published separately, and then the FIP incorporated the Song of Prayer and the Psychotherapy Supplement inside the covers of the course.
Mm-hmm.
So I think now, from the world standpoint, they are absolutely part of the course. But originally, they were seen as somewhat apart, even though connected.
Right.
But yeah, they're canon, of course.
So there are feminine references in the course proper, as you've just outlined, even though there's only like 4. But
more than that.
There are key feminine figures in the course's story, and even though they aren't part of the teaching, they're very important feminine figures again in the course's story, starting with Helen herself. So what does it say that the course was channeled by a woman? That has to be significant, right?
Well, it certainly says that the course doesn't carry some kind of bias against women or sees women as inferior. Helen is on the earthly side of the equation. She is the central figure. As you say, the course comes through her. Without her, there is no course. So there's a lot I think we could say if we had more time about Helen's role in this whole thing and her characteristics. She was a very strong woman. But I think that the big point is it came through a woman.
Mm-hmm. So we have Helen, and we also have another beloved course figure around the circle, at least, and that is the priestess. The priestess is a deeply spiritual figure. Can you say more about her?
Yeah, so in the months before, after Helen and Bill had their Better Way discussion, and before the course started to come through, this is in the summer of 65, Helen was having these visions, apparently of past lives and other kinds of visions too. And in one of her visions, she is this ancient priestess at like the dawn of time. Uh, and she spends her entire life inside the small marble temple in a certain room in that temple. And her whole life is just praying for people who come and ask for her prayers. And at times it seems like there are whole, joyous columns of people coming to this shrine to ask for her prayers. And Bill is a kind of intermediary. He passes on requests to Helen. And all she does is just call down blessings on these people. And she is so devoted that it never occurs to her that her prayers won't be answered. And she's so holy that in Helen's original account of this, she says that she's not entirely solid. She's kind of semi-transparent.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I just find the priestess to be such an inspiring figure for the way in which she prays. She prays with such confidence that she doesn't even ask what's wrong, and she never checks to see whether the prayer had been answered. She just assumes that it has, and
Yeah.
I think it's a model for all of us. But the priestess is indirectly referenced in the course. You can, if you know where to look, there's a footnote on this, but you can spot her in lesson 109, I rest in God, and there's somewhere in the text too. Where is she referenced in the text?
It's in the Reflection of Holiness in chapter 14. And it should be said, I mean, she was mentioned overtly in the dictation of chapter 4. He said, I need devoted priestesses. I need devoted teachers just as I need devoted priestesses. And we took that out because the reader would have no idea what that was about. But she was part of things.
Wow. So we have Helen, we have the priestess, and we also have Mother Mary as a feminine figure in the course. So what do you have to say about that?
Yes, Mary, as with these other figures, does not appear, let's not like directly mention the pages of the course, but she was part of Helen's like inner life. Helen would have visions that featured Mary. She wrote a poem that was really about Mary. Jesus said things about Mary to her. So she hovers there at the margins, even if she's not in the course's actual pages.
And I love Helen's poem about Mary, and I do want to read it if you don't mind. This is called Mother of the World, and it is, as you mentioned so clearly, a reference to Mary. So I'm going to read that. Peace is a woman, mother to the world, whom God has sent to lay a gentle hand across 1,000 children's fevered brows. In its cool certainty there is no fear, and from her breast there comes a quietness from them to lean against and to be still. She brings a message to their frightened hearts from him who sent her. Listen now to her who is your mother in your father's name. Do not attend the voices of the world. Do not attempt to crucify again my firstborn son and brother still to you. Heaven is in her eyes because she looked upon the son who was the first. And now she looks to you to find him once again. Do not deny the mother of the world the only thing she ever wants to see, for it is all you ever want to find.
Mm,
Gorgeous
that's
poem.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what occurs to me as we're talking about Helen and the priestess and Mother Mary is they're all three, they're conduits. They're intermediaries between the spiritual and the physical. And that is an ancient feminine role, not exclusively so, but often associated with the feminine. For instance, back in the days when mediumship was so much of a bigger thing, say, a century, 150 years ago. The mediums were primarily women. So this notion of the conduit, the intermediary, the priestess, really, is traditionally very much a feminine role.
Before they strung them up as witches.
There you go. Yeah. Watch out for those men.
So someone is asking in the chat where the poem was that I just read, and it's from Helen's book, The Gifts of God, which incidentally, as Robert was saying before, also features at the very end a beautiful scribing from Helen called The Gifts of God, confusingly called The Gifts of God, because it's not a poem, although it was referred to originally as a prose poem. But
anyway, the introduction in the book is called a prose poem. So unfortunately, that confusion is
rampant.
There. Yeah.
But it is an absolutely beautiful piece of scribing. The last, as you said, Robert, the last scribing Helen did before she passed. And we'll get to this, but in it, there's a beautiful description of God where he has many feminine qualities, but we'll talk about that in a minute. As far as the feminine figures in the course, we have Helen, we have the priestess, we have Mother Mary, and we also have Mrs. Albert, another beloved figure here at the circle. And notably, Mrs. Albert receives the highest praise from Jesus in the notes of any living person. So let's talk about Mrs. Albert.
Yeah, it's something that kind of, the whole Mrs. Albert discussion, which was pretty lengthy in the notes, it didn't really make it out, beyond the notes. I think there's some in the urtext. But the story is this: as chapter 1 is being dictated to Helen, a friend of hers, Dave Diamond, is dying, and it sounds like she runs into a mutual friend. A friend also of Dave's, at Dave's bedside at the hospital. That's how it sounds. And this friend is Mrs. Albert. Sounds like an older woman because Helen is not calling her by her first name, but calling her Mrs. Albert. And there's more that's said about her than we can really go into here. But the key thing is, Jesus said that both Helen and Bill needed considerable clarification about the channel role, by which he meant the role of channeling miracles, the role of being a miracle worker in the world. And he said, right after that, he said, look carefully at Mrs. Albert. So the clarification they were supposed to get about what it means to be a miracle worker, they were supposed to get by looking carefully at Mrs. Albert. And so then he said, she is working miracles every day because she knows who she is. And what comes through is the portrait of somebody who was incredibly secure in herself, and being secure in herself, she was able to speak her spiritual convictions in a way that Jesus called her giving a miracle, very boldly and openly. And he talked about her as being without embarrassment, but also without hostility. If you have someone speaking their spiritual convictions without embarrassment, but there's that kind of too pushy, too forward, that hint of aggression, too strident, then it's a major turnoff. But if you can imagine somebody speaking those convictions totally innocently and yet with real conviction, there's a power in that. And that's why Jesus clearly implied that what she'd said to Helen was a miracle, was an act of giving a miracle.
So here, once again, we have another female figure who provides such an example. Who wouldn't want to be able to stand for your convictions without being strident or without being embarrassed? I love that Jesus says Mrs. Albert's working miracles every day because she knows who she is. Like, she just has that kind of conviction and confidence where she can just speak her truth. And I know I'm among many who find that to be a very inspiring example as well.
Yeah, me too.
So we've just gone over the feminine references in the course. We've gone over the powerful female figures. And I think it just has to be said that rather than like lament the lack of female references in the course, or to assume that the course has some kind of anti-feminist bias. As course students, it would be wonderful. It would be great if we could claim the references that are there and stand for them. And it's a commonplace assumption that the course is somehow anti-feminist because all of the dominant male figures are male or masculine.
Or talked about that way.
Talked about that way, yeah. And it would be nice if we could just say, well, actually, the course does have feminine references and it does have very powerful female figures, and to just claim that as students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. And I think, though, the big point is much better than that and more important than that. And that is that by filling those old forms, those old pronouns and such with new content, by virtue of that new content, the course contains the antidote. And that's, I think, the most important point here.
Yeah, I was getting to that. But tell us about the solution here. What is the antidote that the course provides to this issue of
I think the answer parity? I think there's a lot to that answer, but I think the nutshell version is that the course takes those old forms of father and son and he and him and brother and fills them with what's clearly genderless content. It's not that the course is saying what's real is maleness and the female is part of the illusion. He just is not acknowledging those divisions between male and female. He's seeing all of us as, in our true reality, genderless. And what that means is that in our true nature, we are not only neither one, but we're the best of both. The best qualities we associate with the masculine and the best qualities we associate with the feminine are there in the true nature of each one of us.
Right. And that is an absolutely beautiful idea that we should be standing for as well. And he does this first and foremost with God. So we all know that God has historically and traditionally carried what we consider to be masculine qualities of vengeance and wrath. But that just isn't there in the course's God. In the course, God is always gentle. He is not aggressive. He's not violent. He is not competitive. He's described as strong, but his strength is always in the context of what he gives to us. And so that's part of what the course does around feeling old, giving new meaning to the language that we have.
Absolutely. And it's very notable. The course does not talk about God as king. Mm-hmm. Rarely, very rarely refers to God as Lord. So there's a very conscious, and it comes through in many, many ways, those just being two of them, a very conscious getting away from that old vision of God as this authoritarian king who dominates and exercises his authority with violence. Okay, so from my standpoint, I think that the course's God is described in ways that make him sound, not in terms of pronouns, but in terms of qualities, arguably more feminine than masculine, more like a mother than a father. If you just step back and look at how he's described, he's primarily a loving parent. He gives birth to his child, being a creator God. I mean, what sex in this world creates life? We know that. And more than that, he doesn't just create his child, his whole existence is his child. He's completely into that relationship. He's completely focused on his child's welfare. He has no other concerns. All he cares about is that child. He gives his whole self to that child. He totally identifies with that child. And that's how he's consistently described in the course.
Well, I mentioned before that there's a description of God in the Gifts of God, scribing from Helen at the end of her book of poetry called Gifts of God. And I wanted to read a little bit of that too, because this is a beautiful description of God. And as you're saying, Robert, these are historically and traditionally feminine qualities that are ascribed to him. It says, he loves you as a mother loves her child, her only one, the only love she has, her all in all, extension of herself, as much a part of her as breath itself. This is how God is described as loving us. As a mother loves her child, her only one, the only love she has, her all in all, extension of herself, as much a part of her as breath itself. Who wouldn't want to be loved like that? And I just, if we had a foundational, fundamental view of God as loving, unconditionally loving, as a mother loves her child from the very beginning, we would be living in a completely different world.
That's true. It's really true. Yeah, and that's exactly how the Course talks about God throughout. God comes off as completely consumed with his relationship with his child. It's everything to him. And which sex do we associate that with? We associate that with motherhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see this loving nature of God in the Course's references to arms and hands as well, don't you?
Yeah, something that's interested me for a while. I've collected all those references, which again is not that hard to do. But Course students recognize, I think, instantly that the references to God's arms and references to God's hands are not meant to be taken literally. He doesn't have physical arms or hands. But what gets more interesting is when you inquire to what meaning they do have, because we're familiar with God's arms and hands from the Bible, where they are really symbols of God exercising his power, very often violently. Okay. In the Course, all of the references to God's arms and hands are about caring. His arms are always talked about as being there to embrace, to hold, to support, as open wide and welcome, being ready to give an embrace. And his hands also are symbols of caring for, because our future, our needs, our spirit, our being are placed in God's hands. And to be in the hands of someone is to be in the care of someone. And so to go from the biblical imagery of God's arms and hands as being about the exercise of power, often through violence, to go from that to his arms and hands are to hug you and to hold you and to care for you. That again sounds like almost like a masculine to feminine trajectory.
Yeah, and everlasting arms is in the Bible. So there is a loving quality to God that was present there, but it was always standing right beside a God that would kill you if you violated his laws. And so we always had this relationship with God where it was like we were afraid of him and loved him out of fear. And in the Course, it's just so different. God is unconditionally loving, and so he sanctions us being unconditionally loving and unconditionally forgiving to people in our lives, versus a God who's angry and wrathful, who sanctions your fear, your own anger and your own wrath. And I can't say enough how important it is that we get these foundational attitudes about God and about Jesus right, because everything springs from them. If Jesus is your William Wallace, holy warrior, man's man, then you're going to have a very different view of him and how you treat other people than if Jesus is a wisdom teacher who sacrificed himself to teach us a lesson about unconditional love and demonstrated that unconditional love all the way up to the point of his own death. These foundational definitions matter because everything springs from them. And there's so much division in our world and so much hierarchy based on these views, these antiquated views of who God is and who Jesus is, and I'll get off my podium now, but
Well, while you're on
I,
the topic of Jesus, did you want to go ahead and add some more?
no, I just no, I won't add anymore. Go ahead. Sorry.
Did you want to say yet more?
And another thing. Go ahead.
Well, while you're on the topic of Jesus, it's very interesting that he did not portray God as king, particularly. There are sort of oblique symbolic references, but he portrayed God primarily as father, and his father, God, was a caregiver God.
Mm-hmm.
And a king that demands obedience and wants to make sure you serve him and do his will is very different than a caregiver whose sole concern is your welfare, right? A caregiver is just to care for you. That's their role. And so I think it's very interesting that the Course takes off from that exact same point, ignoring all of the kingly kind of imagery and thought we've wrapped around God for thousands of years.
Right. And to the point of our conversation today, the unconditionally loving Jesus and the unconditionally loving God was there in the Gospels. And so if you've replaced Jesus from the Gospels with a warrior Christ, and then enshrined that in the Bible so that your misogyny is now scripture, then you're not preaching the Gospels. You are in an all too human power structure. And women have been subjugated in that power structure since the dawn of religion. And so getting us back to
I think just to be fair to all the misogynists in history,
you'd like to be fair to the misogynists in history. Oh, I can't wait for this.
By the time the Gospels were written, the early tradition had managed to sneak into Jesus's teachings, all kinds of teachings of a wrathful God who was going to destroy the cities who didn't listen to Jesus.
Right. And
so I think we have to be picky, and we have to be selective in what we accept as being from Jesus in the Gospels, because if you want a wrathful God, you can find support for it in the Gospels.
True. You can find support for a wrathful Jesus in John, right?
Yeah, but also in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then
really?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's where Jesus says that God's going to destroy the towns that didn't listen to his message.
It's been a long time since. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
And then if you go to the book of Revelation, which is obviously not one of the Gospels, but still, I mean, whoa, there's a lot. I mean, that's where we get our images of apocalyptic thinking. God rains down a lot of destruction in that book.
Right. And then Jesus is going to sit on the right hand of God and judge you and all of that. And I have to say, what my neighbor, I live in North Carolina part of the year, and my neighbor has this flag, and it's Jesus with his crown of thorns and a bald eagle behind him. And I mean, he practically has an AK in his hand. And if that is your view of Jesus, then how are you not using the Bible and what you've put onto him to sanction angry, divisive behavior that only maintains the division of our world, when that's the very thing Jesus came to heal? So anyway, so we've talked about how the Course takes God and infuses God with new meaning. He also does this with sons of God as well. So this is in relation to us. So let's get back on track and talk about that.
Set the soapbox to one side. Okay. So
for now, it's right there. I see it.
Okay. Yeah. So not only is God given new content, but obviously we are too. And one of the ways this happens is by calling us all the Son of God, or calling us sons of God. What that does, I mean, traditionally, the Son of God, we know, is Jesus, right? By calling us the Son of God, that takes that exalted status that we've seen Jesus having, that the dignity, the worth, the power, the closeness with God, the holiness, all of those things we associate with the Son of God are ascribed to all of us, men, women, everyone. And that is a huge, by taking that old form, that verbal form, Son of God, and filling it with new meaning, now it's not just Jesus, it's everyone, that dramatically changes our picture of ourselves.
Right. Because so much of traditional Christianity, at least, has been Jesus is the exalted one, the Son of God, and Eve is the one who got us into all this trouble.
Right. If she just hadn't tempted Adam.
Right. And so what does that say about women and views of women in the church?
Yeah, that was kind of convenient, wasn't it?
Of course. Yeah. It's yeah. So anyway, I feel like where we should go with this is not to kind of burrow too deep into what's gone wrong with traditional Christianity, but to, as you're saying, get back to the antidote that the Course offers, because it really is a truly beautiful picture. And I hear your message from earlier when I was like, well, why don't we stand up for the feminine references in the Course as students? But at the same time, there's a bigger picture even than that. So let's get into that. So what does it say that the Course doesn't acknowledge gender differences with us?
Well, I think that's absolutely key to this whole picture, because what's implied there is that, as obviously that we're genderless, but what's also implied is that from the Course's standpoint, since we have the same nature, we even in heaven, we even all have the same talents. It's not like this person's more talented in this in heaven, this person's more talented in that. We all have the whole thing. So that means that the beautiful qualities we've associated with men and the beautiful qualities we associate with women, all of us have all of those within us. And just today, that brought back to my mind something I haven't thought of for a long time. Carl Jung had this teaching about the animus and the anima. It's not that well known in our culture, but the idea is that each of us has in our unconscious the presence of the other gender. Okay, so that the men have in their unconscious the presence of the feminine, which he called the anima. And women in their unconscious have in it the presence of the masculine, which he called the animus. And the goal in reaching a whole personality, which he called individuation, the goal was to integrate the side opposing your gender. So if you're a man, you integrate into yourself the anima. If you're a woman, you integrate into yourself the animus. And therefore, we achieve wholeness by incorporating in the other side. And of course, what the Course is saying is, yes, and it's not just that we really are men, speaking of myself, who have this in their unconscious, or we really are women who have this in their unconscious, is that in our true nature, we are fully both. We're already integrated. Okay, we don't have to go through a process of becoming whole. We have to go through a process of tapping into who we really are, where we are whole.
That's really interesting, because it feels like what's going on in contemporary spirituality today is a recognition that there is toxic masculinity, but the solution has been the rise of the divine feminine. And so you still have this separation, but you're correcting an error with more separation, right? So instead of incorporating the best of both qualities, as you're saying, what we seem to have done is to say, okay, so there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, warrior, Christ, etc. And so the answer to that is to elevate women, and that can't be right either. So
I'm sure in the grand sweep of things, it's a part of the correction, but maybe not the ultimate solution.
To me, it just feels like more separation. And I think the divine feminine is a beautiful idea. The whole like goddess culture. I'm drawn to it. At the same time, I also can see that it's just more of the same. And
Yeah,
so,
there's a lot of separation that you feel there. It's true.
right, right.
It's
And
true.
so what we need is this integration. We need
What
to
we need is the integration.
we consider ourselves to be completely whole because we are the best of both masculine and feminine.
Right. And why? I mean, I just want to say a bit more about that,
Sure.
because if you're someone who's on a path of development, I think it's just natural that you want to have the full complement of positive qualities in you. And that, I think, by nature, that means that you don't just want to be the best man you can be. You want to be the best person you can be. And that's going to be strengthening qualities that are part of your current gender, but it's also going to be incorporating qualities that you see as on the other side of the divide. Wouldn't it be great if we could just realize, okay, I've got all those qualities. They're just in my true nature that I'm currently trying to get closer and closer to awareness of.
Right. And there, there's such a push for equality now, and this means equality. We can get out of a system that enshrines militant masculinity with the authority of the church. We can get to a place where neither sex is above the other, and that's what we've needed all along. We can get rid of the whole like separate but equal mentality, because if history has taught us anything, it's taught us that separate does not mean equal.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I'll leave
Yeah.
it to you.
Well, the equality piece of this is huge, right? If we're equal because on the level of who we really are, we are the same. We're carbon copies of each other. That is a radical equality. And I think another benefit beyond equality, which, I mean, we probably should say more about that, because we started with the whole inequality theme in your introduction, right? Women have always been seen as inferior in society. So granting this kind of radical equality is huge. But in addition to that, there's the fact that by saying that all of us are neither male nor female, but genderless and whole, it means that there's no, the divide we see when we look out across at the opposite sex and the resulting, war between the sexes, which has been going on for God knows how long, since there were sexes, it's gone on the level of what's real. We can look out and say, okay, well, they have different bodies, they have somewhat different characteristics, but ultimately, we really are the same. And that sameness, I think, is so much more important than the differences. We talk about, women want this, men want that. There's the 5 love languages. In the end, we really want the same things. We have the same problem, the ego, and we have the same truth in us and the same desires. And I think that sameness is just such an important element of the healing of our world.
Yeah, because that's what ultimately is going to create a whole relationship. How can you have something true when you know that your role, your place in the home, for example, is to agree with your husband because he's the head of the household and he gets to tell you what to do because his scripture says he can. And how do you ever have any kind of like realness in that structure? And that's what we're looking for. The way that you get to that realness is by seeing the inherent worth of everyone. I love what you said in the podcast that we had with Marianne Williamson, where it's like we're not just human beings who are deserving of more equal rights. We are divine beings who need to see each other as having every attribute that God has given to us. That we elevate our view of each other and we see that we're the same, and that's what creates the equality in the new world that has less division and less polarization.
Yeah.
all of the divisiveness and polarization that we're seeing in the world today comes from this structure that says I can be on top, right?
I can be on top and you are other. You think about everything that stems from seeing someone, a particular group, whether it's an ethnic group or the opposite sex, as other, stranger, alien, that slides in very easily into enemy. If we don't see each other as other, if we don't see members of the opposite sex as other, I'm thinking about all the kind of anger there is with the whole incel thing, involuntarily celibate. Incel males feel clearly so much anger towards women. If we can look out and no longer see other, then there's healing there, and there's also a possibility for joining. I mean,
True joining.
we all want a relationship, with someone. Most of us, being heterosexual, we want a relationship with someone of the opposite sex. But when you see that person as truly other, how close can you get? How much joining can there be if you are like another species?
Mm-hmm. Well, I always wonder, I mean, that maybe that accounts for, I mean, I know a ton of homosexual relationships that work beautifully. And I wonder if part of it's because, just, yeah, there's a sameness there. And so they're into the same things. And so I think that this rule obviously applies regardless of your orientation. And it's just a beautiful picture. So we have a dramatic new picture here. Not one where
one last thing, and that is, I mean, in addition to sameness, the Course is seeing genuine oneness, where we really are part of each other. We're all parts of the one Sun. And so that's just one last step in wiping away divisions to the maximum possible extent.
Right. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is just not regarding gender divisions as real. And along that line, as I was just saying, not regarding orientations as real, sexual orientations. And God is just so beyond those distinctions that he is very much as much a mother as he is a father. And so are we.
Yeah, I think that in this view, even though at first blush, it looks like the Course has just like ignored the whole female side of things, by using all these masculine pronouns and father and brother and son. In this view is, I think, an acknowledgement that in what the Course is really saying, the actual content it's filling those old forms with, there is a healing of so much, a healing of our view of God, a healing of our view of ourselves as being these fragments, these members of one gender and not the other, a healing of our view of the opposite sex, a healing of our view of women or of anybody as being inferior or as being other. There's so much healing in this. We just have to bite the bullet and say, okay, no one is either male or female ultimately. Yes, in this form, we honor that, but ultimately, no, we are all both.
What a beautiful vision. And it makes sense that Jesus would come back to underscore what he originally said.
It does.
About our equality, our ultimate equality. And Robert, thank you once again for another fascinating discussion. I think third time's the charm.
Yet another.
Third time's the charm on this.
It definitely felt better than the first two. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll see you next time. Bye for now.